So when we talk about decolonization as nation building, we've got to remember that decolonization changed the face of the globe. And let me just bring up some Wikipedia, I think Wikimedia, and you'll see here what a huge change in the global order occurred after World War II. Because really, World War II was the end, the beginning of the end for European dominance, Europe-centered globe, where Europe is really the center of the action and everything else is just the kind of periphery. Because what we can see here is that in the immediate post-war period, South Asia becomes independent, breaking away from the British Empire. And then in the mid-1950s, in the course of events of great significance for Fanon, the French are defeated in Indochina. And you can see Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos becoming independent countries. You can also see the next big wave is in Africa, stretching from the let's say the mid-1950s or the 1950s into the 1960s. And you can see right there, Algeria wins its independence after the Franco-Algerian War, which lasts from the mid-1950s until the early 1960s, when France basically loses the will to stay in Algeria, packs it up, and goes home. Most French went home. They did not want to stay in Algeria if it meant equality with fellow Algerians. The whole point of being a French person in Algeria is you had special privileges. Okay, so Algeria becomes independent in 1962, and that is part of the process, this independence and nation, this war of liberation and nation-building effort. Fanon is part of that process. Okay, so those are current events when Fanon is writing. Okay, so what's going on? We are moving from a world where European empires had basically been the structuring principle for, depends on how you want to count this, but let's say a couple centuries, into a new kind of global order. And what is this new global order? It's the Cold War world. Cold War world. What is this Cold War world? Okay, so the conventional distinctions in this global order are between the first, the second, and the third world. And Fanon himself uses this language, so let's try and explain it. First world is the capitalist bloc, and it is led by the United States. It's the leading power of the first world. The United States presented the first world as technologically advanced, as based in democracy. The United States often described the first world as the free world, okay? And it was premised on a close alliance between the United States and Europe. That was formalized, as some of you know, as what was called NATO, NATO. Okay. The second world was the communist bloc, and it was led by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union presented itself as an alternative to the first world, as a rival to the first world. As we know, the Soviets and the United States were engaged in space race. You know, the Russians, the Soviet Union sends up satellites, and then the United States says, we're behind. We've got to get on the moon first. Okay, and so you have the Apollo missions and so forth. Okay, and there was a kind of race around technological development, and space was the place that you would deploy this newly advanced technologies. Okay, so that was part of the competition. And the Soviet Union had an alternative political system, to say the least. And they were mostly grounded in party rule, usually one party rule. And this idea of one party rule had some connections to that phase that Marx and Engels described as the socialist dictatorship. One of the problems is for a lot of these countries in the Second World, that was not a transitional phase. It became the permanent phase. It didn't move into a sort of more communist system. It just collapsed eventually. That's what happened in the Soviet Union. Okay, then you've got the Third World. And the Third World is basically just a residual category. It's everybody else. And we'll talk a little bit more about this Third World category, but it was used especially to describe most of Africa, most of Asia, and Latin America has always had a tricky positioning with regards to this Cold World tripartite set of distinctions, because most of Latin America, as we saw in some previous maps, had attained formal independence long before these African and Asian countries we were just looking at. But yes, often Latin America was included in Third World kind of discourse and imagination, and sometimes it wasn't. Okay, so the Third World was either the colonized people still fighting for independence or countries that were newly independent. And of course, they wanted economic and technological development too. You know, one of the big problems of this Third World project was development, or as they used to call it then, modernization. Modernization was their way of talking about it. Development, progress, these were all in the same area. But as for political forms, you know, we were talking about the democratic multi-party systems of the First World and the one-party systems of the Second World. The Third World, the political systems ranged very widely, very widely. Sometimes you had kingdoms, sometimes you had one-party systems, sometimes you had multi-party systems. Okay, so there was a great variety. And this in part has to do with the fact that the Third World was a kind of residual category. If you weren't First World, you weren't Second World, this is where you fell. Okay, so what distinguishes the First, Second, and Third World when it comes to stances on colonialism and imperialism? I'll do this pretty quickly because this isn't really in Fanon's book, but it's important background. So, First World, in principle, defends self-determination. And they had been doing this since League of Nations times, where self-determination was considered one of the foundational principles of the global order. Okay, and the idea was all nations have the right to determine their own fate. In other words, there would be national self-governance. That was the basic idea. How that actually played out, though, was a little more complicated, because what you realized, or what you saw, especially in the Cold War era, is that the United States and its allies, yes, would support national self-determination, but if the nation wanted to self-determine itself into a socialist economy and a one-party state, that's where the First World would not prioritize self-determination. Often, the United States would prioritize stopping the spread of socialism, over self-determination. So yes, self-determination, but up to the point that you're actually still part, or at least not hostile to the capitalist bloc. Okay, so it seemed like there was a different bottom line than self-determination, that the real bottom line, if you're looking at it from the Third World perspective, that the real bottom line of the First World is not hostile to capitalism. Okay, And then you've got the Second World. The Second World also defended national self-determination. And those of you who know the history of international communism know that the Third International, this would have been the international sort of forum for the communist movement, supported what they called national liberation. They called this the national question sometimes. And the point here was that oppressed nations which had been colonized by other nations and so forth, they had the right to national self-determination. And they were willing to go far in the First World, in part on principle and in part because it actually helped their cause. They were fine if the nation wanted to self-determine itself into a socialist dictatorship or a socialist economy. But at the same time, and once again, I'm just trying to think myself into the position of a third worldist or somebody from the formerly colonized world, there's also a contradiction between the principles and practice of the Second World. Because although the Second World is in principle in favor of self-determination, just like the First World was in principle in favor of it, they themselves, the Soviets in particular, the Soviet Union, is securing its own, it calls it a sphere of influence, especially in Central Asia and especially in Eastern Europe. So if you talk to folks from, Bulgaria or Kazakhstan and so forth, what the Soviet Union was doing in their countries and their homelands was not that different than what capitalist European powers were doing, say, in North Africa or Southeast Asia. In other words, it sure felt to them and it sure seemed to them like they had been taken into a large empire centered in Russia. Okay. Third worldism is pitched as an alternative to both Western capitalism and Soviet socialism. Okay. And as I said, it's a residual kind of category. So yes, they wanted development, but were they all anti-capitalists and all pro-socialists, or conversely, all anti-socialist and all pro-capitalist? No. And it's the same with regards to political form, as I was just saying. You can't say because you can't say because indeed third world countries weren't all democratic or all socialists or all monarchies. Okay, so there was a great variety in third worldism. The main thing in third worldism, as I for this speech, this is one of the major conferences in third worldism. The speech is given here by President Sukarno of Indonesia because his country, Indonesia, is hosting the conference. You can see here that the basic idea is all of us are united by more important things than those which superficially divide us. How exactly are we going to organize the economy? How exactly are we going to organize the government? We are united by a common detestation of colonialism in whatever form it appears. We're united by a common detestation of racialism. Colonialism and racialism went hand in hand. Colonialism just means in this context, it means the superiority of the colonial power. And here, racialism, closely related idea, means the power of the superior race, or supposedly superior. We're united by a common determination to preserve and stabilize peace in the world. Peace in the world. And I don't have time to get into it, but I'll just read this line. We, the peoples of Asia and Africa, 1.4 billion strong, far more than half the human population of the world. Okay, so this kind of mighty force, the majority, we can mobilize what I've called the moral violence of nation in favor of peace. Very interesting phrase here, the moral violence of nations. That's got tinges of Fanon here, because the idea is the colonial situation, the colonial world is an inherently violent world, and it'll take some kind of violence in the sense of coercion against the colonizer, because right here, Sukarno is saying it's in favor of peace. So this is not necessarily war, but it's going to take some kind of violence or coercion to achieve this peace. And of course, this peace is very important when the United States and the Soviet Union have got thousands and thousands of nuclear bombs ready to drop on one another. Okay, so in a way, what Sukarno here is saying is the third world has got to be non-aligned with either the first world or the second world. Another way of putting this, and this is more conventional military terms, it's neutral. Neutral. So neutrality is this idea that, you know, if, I don't know, France and Germany fighting each other, Switzerland is going to sit this one out. We are not involved. Okay. Fanon, however, doesn't think neutrality or non-alignment is really an option. Fanon says neutrality, non-alignment, let's sit this one out, and so forth, is not really possible for the third world. Why not? Why not? Well, the simplest reason is, Fanon says rather sarcastically, everybody wants a piece of the third world. And by everybody, he means the first and the second world. Because remember, the Cold War is organized into power blocks. And what do leaders of power blocks want? They want more members of power blocks to build up their own power, their own prestige, their own security, and, you know, their own block. Okay, and the Soviets have incentive to do that, and the Americans also have incentive to do that. And when you see the face of the world changing, you realize this kind of Europe-centered global order is falling apart, and you realize there are, you know, dozens of new nations coming onto the global scene and getting seats in the UN and all this. Don't you, if you're a first world or a second world person or a leader, first or second world leader, don't you see your opportunity? Okay, so what was going on, for example, in Soviet propaganda? In Soviet propaganda, which we noticed, so here's a website where you can find a variety of posters from the Soviet period. Here you've got the hammer and sickle. That was one of the symbols of the Soviet Union. Here you've got what looks like a enemy of the Soviet Union on the left coming to attack this kind of rising sign symbol. But look what we have going on here in this picture. I can't read Russian, but Google Translate tells me that sign says "for civil rights." If somebody has a better translation, please let us know in the chat. But what you see here is an African-American man protesting for civil rights. This is like in the middle of the civil rights. This is just after the civil rights movement. If you look at it, the year, it's 1967. And then what have you got? What is the response of, we can't tell exactly what this figure on the right is. I'd be very curious if we had any students who are very familiar with the Soviet artistic practices who could tell us. But it looks to me like a parody of the Statue of Liberty. Statue of Liberty. And what is the response to the demand for civil rights? A machine gun. And then, you know, this is satire. You've got the helmet with the dollar sign. And instead of standing on a statuary, they're standing on what looks like a gunnery, maybe on a battleship or something. And you can see the whole scene is infused with violence. And of course, the asymmetry of the battle between the capitalists and the U.S. government and the African-American protester. It's like a machine gun versus a brick. That is not fair. Okay, that's one of the messages here. And all the protesters asking for is basic civil rights. Okay, so that's one way that, for example, the Second World tried to appeal to people who may have either come from the third world, or who were living in the third world, or who sometimes identified with the third world. And this is certainly what black radicals in the United States, this was the broader set of discussions and debates that they were participating in. That's in part, as I mentioned in our first Fanon lecture, why radicals like the Black Panthers were drawn to Fanon. Okay, so the United States knew this was happening. The United States knew that these images that were being broadcast all over the world of African American protesters just asking for basic rights that were supposed to be guaranteed to all citizens, like voting rights, how these protests were being met with police brutality and, the segregationist police with sick dogs on black protesters, and, with the clubs beat black protesters. And, this was, in a lot of ways, it was a PR nightmare for the United States government. And so people in the Kennedy administration, in the Johnson administration, knew that the first world, the limits of what it would accept as self-determination, that was already working against the first world appeal to the third world. And it knew that this civil rights movement and the violent responses, the violent government responses to the civil rights movement, were also giving it a sort of a bloody nose on the world stage. Okay, and so there's one theory of the civil rights reform, which basically says the United States knew that if it wanted to appeal to third world nations, these newly independent nations in Africa and Asia, it would have to fix its domestic race relations. And on this theory, Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, all these reforms that came in the mid-1960s had this kind of global competition with the Soviet Union behind it. Okay, let me come a little closer to what Fanon is saying more directly. Fanon says in the Cold War period, all local struggles take on a quasi-universal dimension. And what Fanon means by this is just local struggles are global. Local struggles are global because, at least in part, there are mass media and mass communications. And I won't get into this, but Fanon, in another book called A Dying Colonialism, talks about, for example, how mass communications which were brought by the French to Algeria, like the radios, were then used by the FLN, the National Liberation Front movement, to communicate amongst each other. And you had like underground radio, and you had people cheering when they were listening to these radio broadcasts, because the radio broadcasts were telling them the opposite of what the French broadcasts were saying, which is that the FLN was winning, and to have hope and to have courage in all this. The official media, of course, was saying, you're losing, you're getting crushed, and so forth. Okay, so mass communications are making consciousness more global. It's making more people in different parts of the world more aware of what's going on in other parts of the world. So, for example, when there was a massacre, in South Africa. What was the global consciousness of this? This was the Sharpeville massacre of 1960s. Fanon describes this on page 35. Let me just read very quickly from this passage. Fanon says the Sharpeville massacres. Okay, sorry, I forgot to say what the Sharpeville massacres are. So the Sharpeville massacres happened as a response to protests against the pass system in South Africa. So in South Africa, one of the things that the apartheid regime tried to do was limit the freedom of movement of black South Africans and what were called colored South Africans. So most Asians, for example, fell into the colored category. And you would have to show your papers all the time. You would just, every time you were moving across various parts of the country, at any time, a public official could ask a black or a brown person, where are your papers? Okay, and people were getting fed up and sick of this because this was not being demanded of white South Africans or just white people in general. So these protesters gathered around a police station. There were a lot more protesters than there were police. The police panicked, and as Fanon would point out, colonialism has always had the bottom line of brutal violence. They opened fire. Dozens of people are killed. Hundreds are wounded. It was a big, bloody, and painful affair. And what happens? The Sharpeville massacre shook public opinion for months. It shook public opinion, for example, in Britain and in the United States. In the press, over the airwaves, and in private conversations, Sharpeville has become a symbol. It's become a symbol of not just anti-apartheid protests in South Africa. It's become a symbol of the brutality of European and European-derived colonialism all over the world. It is through Sharpeville that men and women address the problem of apartheid in South Africa, and there's no reason to believe that demagoguery alone explains the sudden interest by the main powers, say UK and South Africa, in the petty affairs, petty being ironically deployed here, the petty affairs of the underdeveloped region. Here's the key line. I'm on page 35. Every peasant revolt, every insurrection of the Third World fits into the framework of the Cold War. You can't get around it. Okay, Fanon also talks about Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu was the turning point in the French-Vietnamese War. So the Vietnamese were fighting against the French for their independence, as I mentioned, almost immediately after World War II ended. And Dien Bien Phu was the turning point. Fanon says, all these anti-colonial struggles, all these third world struggles, they are asking themselves, how can we have our Dien Bien Phu? And all the colonizers and all the colonial powers are asking themselves, how can we avoid a Dien Bien Phu? So once again, this local struggle between French and Vietnamese forces, now this awareness of it is getting spread all over the world, and revolutionaries and colonizers alike are asking themselves, what lessons can we learn here? What lessons can we learn here? Okay, Fanon, Wretched of the Earth, Chapter 3. I'm probably only going to be able to talk about Fanon's relationship to Marxism. Okay, and then we're going to eventually get into the dangers of what Fanon calls neocolonialism, or the dangers you will run into after formal national independence, but when these former colonial powers are still around and still capable of exercising considerable influence. Okay, Fanon's stretching of Marxism. As we already saw in Chapter 1, Fanon argues that Marxism has got to be worked and reworked to deal with or analyze colonial societies. So you remember that line about race and class are layered onto each other in a colonial situation. You're rich because you're white because you're rich, you're poor because you're black, and you're black because you're poor. Okay, so that's one way Marx thinks that this Marxism has to be reworked. And another way he thinks it needs to be worked is Marxism is a European social theory. It was developed to explain European development, the development of European societies, and there was always a question that was not particularly well answered by Marx or even Engels or even Lenin, anyone in this kind of European Marxist tradition, as to where non-European societies fit within the overall framework of Marxism. So, for example, as we saw from our Marx and Engels lectures, Marx assumed one line of development, and really what he was trying to talk about was European societies which had begun in tribes and bands and what he called primitive communism, how those European societies would develop through alienated civilization, the ancient Greek and Roman period, the feudal European Christian period, the industrial sort of modern European period, into, so primitive communism develops through alienated civilization into what Marx conceived of as advanced communism. Okay, and so all the details here, just forget about it because we've already covered those, and we don't need to remember the details. And you can always consult the previous lectures or any number of diagrams on the internet if you're interested in the details again. So just take the details out. But the three-stage thing. The question is, where do African and Asian societies, so-called traditional African and Asian societies, fall in this schema? Where do pre-colonial Asian societies, pre-colonial African societies fall in this schema? Well, Marx, for the most part, just did not talk about Africa. And this is a bias he inherited from one of his great philosophy teachers, Hegel, Hegel, Hegel. If you're interested, you can look that up, Marx and Hegel. Okay, so really Africa was just left out of the picture. And then as we saw, when Marx talked about Asia, he kind of slotted it around a feudal period, the equivalent to like a feudal period in Europe. But in other works, and we didn't read these, but there's a book called The Groundwork, where Marx explicitly addresses the question of Asia. You can see that it's just off to the side. It's just off to the side. And what Marx basically said is there's this thing called the Asiatic mode of production. It's a very weird term, and there's a lot of debate around it, what exactly Marx meant by it. But the idea, we already saw the idea in the British rule in India. The idea is Asian societies are outside of this unilinear developmental narrative, and they are brought inside it by the British. They are brought inside it by the British, and what Marx expects is India will, as a colony, come in around the feudal period and then be developed into a kind of industrial society by somebody else, by the way. So first of all, one problem that Fanon would have with this narrative is he doesn't think that in terms of modernization, in terms of making history, he doesn't think that Asian societies and African societies are simply waiting around for some European to come in and initiate their development. Okay, Fanon is all about doing. Fanon is all about the third world doing stuff on its own behalf. That is an expression of Fanon's ideal of national self-determination. It's that the people themselves, especially the most damned or the most wretched, will take their destiny into their own hands. So that's one problem with this Marx narrative. You remember, Marx's whole idea is it's the British who initiate what he calls a social revolution in India. Marx would say, yes, and then the Indians will initiate their own social revolution and take their newly independent Indian nation state in the direction they want to go. Okay, and then Fanon says, well, where are these third world countries going? And here's where Fanon shows that he is not only an anti-colonial thinker, but also a socialist thinker. He says that the third world has got to skip capitalism. So this is very interesting. So Fanon says, and now we're dealing with this this unilinear scale on the left. Fanon says, yes, okay, Algeria is more or less in what he calls a feudal state. And basically what he means is most of the workers are in the countryside and most of them are working in agriculture. Okay, let's not talk about the aristocrat thing because it's a little different. But that's basically what Fanon means. When you see Fanon using this feudalism language, that's what he means. Okay, and then he's saying you've got to skip or leapfrog this industrial period and go straight for socialism. And there's a reason Fanon thinks that the third world should just leapfrog that capitalist stage altogether. One reason is he doesn't think that capitalism has been particularly good for the third world. In fact, he thinks that the third world is in the predicament it's in, low literacy rates, low electricity, mostly agricultural, and so forth, low calorie counts, and so forth, because the third world has, for a long time, been on the periphery of somebody else's capitalist society. So the Indians were on the periphery of the English industrial system. They were part of it, but they were the exploited part. They were the raw materials, and those raw materials were supposed to be brought back to England and worked on under proper capitalist, wage labor relations, and then shipped back to India and sold to India to the profit of the British, to the profit of these British firms. Okay, so first of all, Fanon is a little skeptical because he's basically asking, well, global capitalism, how has that worked out for you? Okay, so Fanon is saying there has to be a kind of socialist alternative. There has to be a kind of third world alternative, and part of that will be the blending of third worldism with socialism. At the same time, he doesn't think, and we can't really get into the details of it, that you can just take what the Soviets did and just take what the Second World is doing and just import it willy-nilly without any consideration of local conditions or local customs or of context, really, and just say, oh, yes, Comrade Stalin has worked it out all for us. You see how the Soviets have industrialized? We got to do that too. No, that's not what Fanon is saying. Not what Fanon is saying. At the same time, Fanon does think that there are certain nuggets of wisdom or certain insights within the European Marxist tradition which are basically universal and which will travel into, say, post-colonial Algeria. Algeria has already won the War of Independence, and Algeria, which is now trying to build up the nation, especially economically speaking. And this is what you see Fanon trying to do on page 133. Fanon says, in the regions where we, and now he's speaking as a FLN intellectual, and the FLN, after it was a social movement which won independence, it became, basically it became the ruling party of Algeria. So now he's speaking as a kind of party intellectual. This is Fanon, party intellectual speaking. In regions where we were able to conduct these enlightening experiments, we witnessed the edification of man through revolutionary teachings. So the revolution is not over. There's this future stage where you actually have to you can't just take down colonialism. You now actually have to build something up. Okay, the peasant clearly grasped the principle whereby the clearer the commitment, the better one works. Okay, so this is interesting. So Fanon is saying, work has got to have, some purpose, some broader purpose. For example, like nation building behind it. And he thinks the quality of work that will come from that commitment, say, to the nation, that's the key. That's the key factor. So what does he mean by this commitment? We, again, he's speaking as a kind of party leader, party intellectual, we were able to convey to the masses that work is not only a physical exercise or working of certain muscles. No, work is more than that. One works more with one's brain and more with one's heart than with muscles or sweat. And what you should be hearing here are tinges of Marx's idea that labor and our capacity to create a world and a capacity to creatively work, that's a kind of spiritual power. That's a kind of distinctively human capacity. And that is the capacity that Fanon thinks, Marx called it labor capacity or labor power. That is the capacity that Fanon thinks needs to be put to work in the nation building phase. Okay, so you can hear here hints of and resonances with this Marxist desire for the worker to be emancipated, for the worker to not be alienated. Okay, but Fanon goes beyond what Marx is saying. Okay, we don't want alienated labor. We don't want the workers' labor capacity to be controlled by somebody else, because what Fanon is thinking about is a worker, say a peasantry or an industrial worker, or really a party intellectual. They're working too. All these new citizens have got to put their labor capacity into a new nation-building project, which is not alienating themselves, but which is rather expressing themselves and allowing them, as it were, to be themselves. Okay, so it's a complicated relationship here between Fanon's anti-colonialism and his kind of socialism, but I think that's the general idea. Here's another way that Fanon doesn't think that Marxism can be just willy-nilly imported into Algeria or any other new African or third world nation. He thinks Marxism is too class-focused and is not, to use contemporary language, intersectional enough. It doesn't see how class and race intersect due to colonialism. Because if you take the Marxist perspective very seriously, there's really only two kinds of people in the world. You're either a bourgeoisie or a proletariat. Okay, and then there are these intermediate categories, petty, bourgeoisie, and so forth, but we'll get into those later. Okay, there's really just two kinds of people. And what Fanon wants to do is layer that set of distinctions, capitalist and worker, with the other set of distinctions that was created by colonialism, which is the colonizer colonized. Okay, so now you just think in your head this four square thing. Now you've got colonizing bourgeoisie, colonizing worker. You've got colonized bourgeoisie, colonized worker. And this helps us make sense of what Fanon is trying to do in this chapter 3, which is to distinguish between the first world bourgeoisie, that's the colonizing bourgeoisie, and in the Cold War period after independence, let's just call it the first world bourgeoisie, and the third world bourgeoisie, which emerges from the colonized bourgeoisie. Okay, so let's talk about the first world bourgeoisie. Fanon says, first world bourgeoisie, sometimes called the metropolitan bourgeoisie, they're productive. They're productive. So this is no real departure from Marxism, because remember, Marxism is trying to explain the European bourgeoisie. European bourgeoisie built up its productive power under feudal society and European feudalism, European Christian Middle Ages. Okay, and you remember that whole story about how the bourgeoisie emerged in the town. The name bourgeoisie, in fact, is like town dweller, basically, in a variety of European languages. Bourgeoisie is just the French version of it. And they came up with a more efficient way to produce more things. That's basically it. They invented the industrial system, and they invented better ways of banking and better ways of moving stuff around, transport, and so forth. So they actually produced the goods. They delivered the goods. Okay, and they moved all of European society to, according to Marx, a higher stage of civilization, capitalism. They moved it out of the Dark Ages into the Enlightenment and science and capitalism and all that. So there were developments in European civilization that were directly attributable to the European bourgeoisie. Okay, but at the same time, and this is also something that Marx, I think, would admit, this is where he was gesturing in his writings on India. At the same time, the European bourgeoisie underdeveloped the rest of the world. It was to the economic advantage of the British national state, which, again, as Marx would say, is just like which is mostly acting in the interest of world capitalism, which is mostly acting in the interest of the English bourgeoisie. It was in the interest of the British Empire to keep India a source of cheap raw materials and cheap labor, and also to keep them as a sort of captured market for the selling of manufactured goods, for example, textiles. Okay, so for whatever flaws or whatever injustices this bourgeoisie may have perpetrated abroad, at least in Europe, it actually delivered the goods. It was a productive class. Now, the problem with the third world bourgeoisie, according to Fanon, and they're often called the national bourgeoisie, is they are not productive. They are parasitic. And the reason is historical. So there's some moral language here. You know, you'll see Fanon condemning this national bourgeoisie as, well, he calls them parasitic. That's, first of all, that's not a, if you're a socialist, when you call somebody a parasite, you're basically saying they're a leech or a vampire or whatever, somebody living off the exploitation of somebody else. Okay, so that's kind of moral. But he also says they're grasping and they're greedy and they're unimaginative and their character is not all that great. Okay, that's what Fanon would say. However, also notice that what Fanon is actually offering here is a historical explanation. So the historical explanation is this bourgeoisie emerged under colonial conditions. So if the first world bourgeoisie is productive because it emerged under feudal conditions, third world bourgeoisie is parasitic because it emerged under colonial conditions. Because what was going on in a colonial society? In a colonial society, you've got the metropolitan bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie from Europe, who are running the show. And then there are a small amount of people. And then the basic division is between them and the, let's call them the native or the indigenous population, most of whom are in the countryside, many of whom are peasants. Okay? What did the first world colonizers need in order to effectively administer and to effectively run these colonies? They needed a buffer class. They needed an intermediary class. And indeed, no European colonialism would have lasted 10 years had they not been able to recruit and give upward mobility to a class of the best educated and the already higher class status among the indigenous population, and get them to basically not resist at a minimum and to offer incentives to cooperate at a maximum. So now we come into these questions about complicity and so forth. But, you know, if you are among the indigenous population and you don't think, as Fanon says in the first chapter, you don't really think there's realistic chances of winning a military confrontation against these colonizers. You don't think in the immediate future you're really going to be dealing with anything other than a colonial society. You could see there is some, let's call it reason or some incentive to actually cooperate here. Okay, so the idea is the first world bourgeoisie needed a sort of class of people who would run the government, who would, you know, at the local government office kind of represent the colonial regime to the great masses of the colonized. And the idea was things would kind of run more smoothly and tensions would be a little more diffused if there were some avenues of upward mobility. And when a local peasant went to the government office with a complaint, they would see people who could speak their language, who understood their customs, and could somehow relate. Okay, but here's the problem, Fanon says. If that is your bourgeoisie, you've basically got a capitalist class in the post-independent period without capital. They never developed the productive power that is characteristic of the first world bourgeoisie. Rather, you've got a third world bourgeoisie, a national bourgeoisie, which largely consists in the civil service and of lawyers and doctors and of government bureaucrats and officials. So if that's your bourgeoisie, that's not, properly speaking, a capitalist class, because you remember in a socialist analysis, in the Marxist analysis, what makes you a capitalist is not your attitudes towards capitalism. That's a peculiar and American definition. Do you support capitalism or not? It's, do you own capital? Do you own the means of production? So Fanon says this third world bourgeoisie is a bourgeoisie in name only. It is a capitalist class without the most essential feature of the capitalist class, which is capital. It's a capitalist class without capital.